Imagine the sheer absolute panic.
Yeah.
You're living in a society that just a decade ago was completely fractured. Like tribes constantly at war, blood feuds lasting for generations, no central law whatsoever.
Just total chaos, right?
Exactly. And then this single visionary arrives, unites everyone, and basically builds an entirely new civilizational structure from scratch. And he holds it all together.
Yeah.
But then, and here is the crux of it, that visionary dies. What happens the very next day? Does that brand new civilization, instantly collapse back into chaos? Or does it somehow survive that ultimate stress test?
I mean, history gives us plenty of examples of movements just completely dying the second their founder breathes their last,
Oh, for sure.
It's incredibly rare for a movement to transition from, like, a physical person holding everything together to an internalized system that actually outlives them.
Right. So welcome to today's deep dive. We're exploring a truly fascinating essay today titled The Prophet's Legacy, From Divine Presence to Eternal Civilization.
Yeah, it's a great piece.
It really is. And our mission here is to explore how the author analyzes the legacy of Prophet Muhammad. We're looking at a very specific historical moment, which is the 28th of Safar in the year 11 AH.
Right, and just for context for you listening, AH means after Hijrah in the Islamic calendar. So we're talking about the year 632 AD in the city of Medina.
Right, okay, let's unpack this. Because the author takes a very deliberate approach to that date, instead of framing his passing as just, a tragic end to his physical life. The text frames it as a catalyst for his civilizational rebirth.
Exactly. The argument is that this single event basically split human history into two distinct halves.
Wow.
Yeah, but to really grasp the magnitude of that transition, the text insists we have to look at the mechanics of what he actually built while he was alive.
Yeah, because we can't understand the vacuum his death created without understanding the machine he built, right?
Oh.
The source claims he took a society mired in the narrowness of superstition and moved it into the vast horizon of human dignity. But, what does that actually mean on the ground?
Well, the author points to two massive structural overhauls that were just completely unprecedented for a 7th century tribal society.
Okay, what was the first one?
So the first was the establishment of legally binding pluralism, and this was achieved through something called the Charter of Medina.
I want to pause on that because when we hear pluralism today, we immediately think of a modern democracy. How did a document in 632 AD actually enforce that?
Right, you'd think it was just a peace treaty telling warring tribes to play nice.
Exactly. Was it just that?
Much more than a peace treaty, actually. The text frames the Charter of Medina as a foundational governance document. It didn't just ask people to get along. It legally defined the rules for how disparate tribes, pagans, Jewish communities, and the new Muslims would coexist as a single civic body.
Okay, so it created shared responsibilities.
Yes, shared responsibilities for the defense of the city and actual mechanisms for resolving disputes without resorting to those endless blood feuds.
That's fascinating. So it's literally redefining citizenship.
Yeah.
It's shifting identity away from, I belong to this specific bloodline, to, we're all bound by this shared civic structure. Which I think leads perfectly into this second major shift the author highlights.
Right, complete abolition of racial discrimination.
Yeah.
The author encapsulates that shift using a very famous quote from the Prophet, which is, "No preference for an Arab over a non-Arab except by piety."
I mean, think about how radical that would sound to someone living in that era.
Oh, completely earth-shattering.
Right. In a society where your entire worth, your safety, your economic standing, all of it was determined entirely by your genealogy.
Yeah.
He is basically detonating the foundational social hierarchy.
He really is. He's replacing a system based on ancestry with a meritocracy based on moral action and character.
Which is wild for the 7th century.
Totally. And the text argues that this structural engineering is exactly why his legacy isn't only studied by theologians. It's heavily scrutinized by legal scholars, sociologists, political scientists globally.
Right. The author brings in several prominent Western thinkers to prove this point, right?
Yeah.
To show how they recognize the sheer mechanics of his civilizational architecture.
Yeah, exactly.
I noticed that list in the text, but let's dig into why those specific institutions and thinkers cared. Like, the text mentions Harvard University immortalizing Quranic verses concerning justice on the walls of its law school.
Yeah.
Why would a modern Western law school care about a 7th century religious text?
Because they're looking at the legal framework it introduced, the Harvard reference, along with the text mentioning the Paris Congress of Comparative Law, it really underscores that Western legal traditions recognize him as a paramount legislator.
So they're acknowledging that he didn't just preach personal morality.
Right, he instituted a robust, functional system of justice and societal equity that actually worked in practice. And the author also brings up physicist Michael Hart, who famously ranked him as the #1 most influential person in history.
Oh, right. And the essay goes on to quote the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw, too.
Yes.
Shaw claimed that if Muhammad were to rule the modern world, he would solve its problems in a way that would ensure peace. That is a massive claim,
It's huge.
especially since Shaw wasn't a theologian. He was a social critic looking at systemic failure.
Exactly. The author includes Shaw to highlight the systemic nature of the prophet's solutions. And then the text also brings in the French writer Lamartine.
What did Lamartine say?
He rhetorically asks who could even compare to him. And Lamartine's reasoning, according to the source, is based on a very specific metric. It's the grandness of the purpose, the smallness of the resources, and just the staggering success of the result.
Right. I mean, you have a man starting with basically nothing in a harsh desert, facing incredible opposition, and he ends up forging a unified nation.
Yeah. The text also cites the Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle, who dedicated an entire chapter to his sincerity, and the historian Montgomery Watt, who documented how he successfully integrated all these warring factions.
So the overarching point the author is making with all these Western perspectives is that the genius of his leadership was undeniable, even from entirely secular or, non-Islamic viewpoints.
Precisely. He was the chief engineer of an incredibly complex social machine.
But wait, this brings me back to my initial question. It sounds like he wasn't just preaching, he was drafting a constitution. It's almost like comparing the Charter of Medina to an early Magna Carta, but way ahead of its time.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
But if he was this incredibly central figure, the visionary holding the charter together, enforcing this new meritocracy, doesn't his death create a massive catastrophic vacuum?
Well, yes.
Like if you build an incredible machine, but the chief engineer dies, doesn't the machine just fall apart? Especially when human nature is so naturally tribal.
And that tension you're talking about is the central theme of the entire essay. The source argues that his death wasn't just a loss, it was a mandatory transition.
A mandatory transition.
Yeah. It was this agonizing shift from relying on the presence of the person to the much harder generational task of guarding the message.
Okay, because while he was alive, his sheer physical presence imposed order.
Right.
If you had a dispute, you went to him. If you were tempted to revert to tribalism, his authority stopped you. It forced an outward unity.
The author notes that exact dynamic. His physical presence acted as a sort of gravitational pull, but the moment he died, that gravity was gone.
Wow.
The text describes this as the ultimate crucible for the early community. It forced them to answer a brutal question. Were they loyal to a remarkable man who is now gone? Or had they actually internalized the eternal principles he taught?
It's the classic founder's dilemma that startups or massive social movements face today.
Exactly.
When the charismatic founder steps down or passes away, the culture is immediately tested. The text makes it sound like the early community faced a total existential crisis.
They absolutely did. And to illustrate just how severe that crisis was, the author points to a specific verse in the Quran Al-Imran, verse 144. It's a verse that directly confronted the community about this exact vulnerability, even before he died. It asks, Muhammad is not but a messenger. If he died or was killed, would you turn back on your heels?
Turn back on your heels. There's such a visceral image.
It really is.
It implies a total cowardly regression, an active undoing of all that progress from superstition to dignity. It's asking, are you just going to go back to your blood feuds the second I'm not looking?
And the text suggests that for many, the answer was sadly yes. The author includes a quote from Imam Ali, who was the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law who observed the fallout of this transition.
What did he observe?
Well, according to the text, Imam Ali stated that different paths deceive the people, and they essentially abandoned the very cause they were ordered to love and uphold once that physical authority was gone.
Man, so if the community is fracturing and the physical presence of the leader is gone, how does the author determine whether the civilization passed or failed the test?
Right.
Like, how do you diagnose the health of a movement that is supposedly guarding a message?
The author introduces a specific and deeply historical metric to answer that. The text refers to it as the revealing mirror.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
It does. Now, keeping in mind this is the author's historical and theological perspective, the true measure of the community's loyalty wasn't found in how perfectly they recited prayers or performed daily rituals.
Okay, then what was it?
The real test was how they treated the prophet's direct family, known as the al-Bayt. The author calls them the living pulse of his legacy.
Let me push back on this a bit, because earlier we discussed how the prophet completely abolished racial discrimination and preference based on bloodlines.
Right, right.
He literally said there's no preference for an Arab over a non-Arab except by piety. So isn't it a bit of a contradiction for the author to then say the ultimate test of loyalty is how the community treats his specific blood relatives?
It's a fair question, but the author addresses this tension by framing the al-Bayt not just as like royal blood, but as the living, walking embodiment of the message itself.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, from the perspective of the text, they weren't owed allegiance simply because of their genetics. It was because they were the purest repositories of his principles, his justice, and his character. So oppressing them wasn't just a political misstep.
It was an active rejection of the values they represented.
Exactly.
It's like trying to gauge the true health of a society by looking at how it treats its most vulnerable, or in this case, how it treats the direct, living legacy of its founder. The author is basically saying, you can't claim to love the architect while you are tearing down his house.
That is a perfect way to put it. And the text is unapologetically critical here. It details specific historical events to argue that the early community fundamentally failed this test.
What events does the author point to?
The text specifically mentions the oppression of Zahra, the prophet's daughter. It mentions the marginalization of Ali from leadership, and ultimately the tragic slaughter of his grandson, Hussein.
And for you listening, these are massive, deeply traumatic events in Islamic history. The author isn't just listing them as sad footnotes.
No, they are presented as structural civilizational failures. The author's thesis is that every single time one of these family members was marginalized or wronged, a silent question was echoing through the wider nation.
Which was what?
The question was, how are you preserving the prophet in his family? And by extension, how are you guarding his core message?
Right. The argument is that you simply cannot separate the abstract message from the actual people who most closely embody it.
Exactly.
If a society allows the al-Bayt to be marginalized, they have failed the mandate to guard the message. They have, as that Quranic verse warned, turned back on their heels.
But the author doesn't let the reader off the hook by just leaving this as some ancient historical tragedy. The essay deliberately pivots from the 7th century to the present day.
Which is crucial, because how does an essay about a leadership crisis in 632 AD actually apply to you and me navigating the modern world?
Right.
What is the practical application here?
Well, the text argues that the prophet's legacy isn't meant to be dry history. It's a living pulse, meant to be a moral compass for billions of people right now.
Okay. In what way?
It's supposed to inspire people to face down contemporary oppression. It's supposed to act as a guide to steer modern economies away from endless greed and the exploitation of the weak. The author explicitly warns that the true challenge today, amidst all these global wars and division, is not getting trapped in the outward appearance or rituals of the religion.
Man, it is incredibly easy to just focus on the aesthetics, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Like doing the rituals, wearing the right clothes, claiming membership in the group, all while completely ignoring the hard, uncomfortable work of actually living out the spirit of justice and equity.
And the author sees that superficiality as a total betrayal of the legacy. To combat it, the text lays out 3 distinct pillars for individuals to actively revive this legacy today.
Let's walk through those 3 pillars, because this is where the essay really demands action from the reader.
Sure, so the first pillar is located in our minds. The author says we revive the legacy when we actively use its principles to build civilization and cultivate peace.
So it requires intellectual engagement, not just passive belief.
Right.
Which means actually looking at the framework of something like the Charter of Medina and applying that standard of pluralism to how we govern diverse societies today.
Exactly. Then the second pillar takes place in our souls. And this is the brutal internal work.
Oh boy.
Yeah, we revive the legacy when we intentionally free ourselves from bigotry, racism, tribalism, and really anything that blocks us from embracing universal justice.
That connects directly back to dismantling the preference for an Arab over a non-Arab mindset. It means actively hunting down and destroying our own internal prejudices.
Precisely. And finally, the third pillar manifests in our reality. The author states we revive the legacy when we physically, tangibly stand in solidarity with the oppressed and the marginalized.
Which brings us to perhaps the most striking, uncompromising quote provided in the entire source.
Yeah, this one gets hard.
The prophet is quoted as saying, "Whoever hears a man calling, 'O Muslims,' and does not answer, is not a Muslim."
The author uses that quote to force a total paradigm shift.
So what does this all mean? Think about the weight of that statement. It completely redefines what it means to belong to the community.
Yeah, it does.
It rips away the idea that identity is just a passive checklist of beliefs. It turns belonging into a state of mandatory, active empathy. The author is highlighting that if you hear someone crying out for help and you choose apathy, you don't just get a penalty point.
No, you literally forfeit your identity within the community.
Exactly.
When you synthesize all the author's arguments, you realize that apathy is the real enemy of the legacy here.
Yeah.
The text argues that the actual death of the prophet's light doesn't happen when his physical heart stops beating. It happens when people willingly accept humiliation and settle for empty rituals instead of fighting for substantive justice.
So the 28th of Safar isn't meant to be just a historical anniversary of a death or, a day of passive mourning. The text is framing it as a call to renew awareness.
An annual audit of the community's conscience, really.
Yeah.
And the essay concludes by offering a navigational tool for this ongoing challenge. The author mentions that the prophet left behind a ship of salvation known as the Thekalain, or the two weighty things.
Okay, what are the two weighty things?
They are the Book of Allah, the Quran, and his family, or lineage, the Al-Bayt.
So the abstract divine ideology paired with the living, breathing human embodiment of that ideology.
Exactly. They are presented as the ultimate safeguards against turning back on our heels. The author leaves the reader with a definitive directive. The ultimate question we should be asking isn't the historical mystery of where did Muhammad go from history?
Because physically we know exactly where he went and when.
Right. But the author is demanding we answer a much more difficult present-day question.
Much is.
How much of his guidance do we carry today to actually build humanity and civilization?
Wow. That brings us full circle to the very beginning, right back to that ultimate founder's dilemma. It's the metric by which any enduring movement has to be judged. And it leaves you, the listener, with a really compelling thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Definitely.
The source strongly argues that true loyalty to a visionary isn't about perfectly reciting their words from memory. And it certainly isn't about flawlessly performing their rituals. True loyalty is about whether you are actively building the world they envisioned. So take a look at the institutions, the leaders, the philosophies, or even the companies you follow in your own life today. Are you fiercely guarding their core message of justice and action? Or have you just settled for the comfortable, empty rituals of belonging?
That's a profound question to end on.
It really is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.